The following pre-recorded program is sponsored by Adams Financial Concepts. Welcome to About Money, a different approach to investing you won't hear anywhere else. Your host, Mike Adams, is a registered investment advisor and works with investment portfolios exceeding over $100,000 in net worth and has a proven track record of managing long-term investments, surpassing the markets in the long term. The information shared in the following program is for educational purposes only, and any investment advice given may not be suitable for all investors. And now, here's Mike.
And so it is Saturday, and we're talking about money. We got so much to cover today, so stay with me. We've got so much that's interesting, I think. You know, financial advisors are licensed either under the Securities and Exchange Act of 1932 or the Investment Company Act of 1940. The brokerage firms, the Merrills, the UBSs, the Morgan Stanleys, and some of the smaller ones like Royal Bank of Canada, RBC, and some of those are licensed under the Securities and Exchange Act of 1932. They're brokerage firms. They are what they say. They're brokerage. The idea was that they would sell stocks or they would sell bonds, and that was, or annuities or whatever they were doing, and that was something that fell under the Securities and Exchange Act of 1932. Registered investment advisory firms, investment advisors, fall under the Investment Company Act of 1940, and there's a very big difference between the two. Most people don't recognize it. Everybody's called a financial advisor, but there is a difference between the two. Under the Securities and Exchange Act of 1932, you have registered reps, registered representatives of the brokerage firm. Their recommendations only have to be suitable. They can make a recommendation that are both in the same area, but one pays a higher commission than the other, and they can recommend the higher commission. Small cap fund, one that pays 1 or 3% in commission, a representative can recommend the 3% commission, even if the returns are going to be lower, because it's suitable for a small cap fund. Registered investment advisors under the Investment Company Act have to make every decision in the best interest of their client. That cannot be a decision that a registered investment advisor brings. So going back to 2007-8, there were a number of things to control the brokerage firms, the banks, and the investment houses, and the insurance companies. But the big brokerage houses, the banks, and the insurance companies have pressed back on the regulations that were passed in 2007, 2008, 2009, and 2010, and they've been successfully taking away all the regulations of the 1940 Act. The law, the language, and the logic, they're all gone. The losers are the clients that are clients of those big brokerage firms. The winners are the brokerage firms, the banks, and the insurance companies. Later in the program, I'm going to revisit this and come back to it. You want to hear, if you're a client of one of the big brokerage firms, you need to hear what's going on. If you have a 401k, you need to hear what's going on. But before we get there, before we get to that, you've walked downtown and you've come to street corners and you notice those little yellow sloping paths with the bumps. You know what those bumps actually are? They actually are in Braille. And the inventor of that is, here's my guest on the program. You want to hear what he has to say, because that's just one of his inventions. There's a lot more. That's coming up. But before we get to my guest, more to talk about. A few years ago, I read the book, Trust Us, We Are the Experts, How Industry Manipulates Science and Gambles with Your Future, by Sheldon Rampton and John Stober. And in the book, they talk about the case of Betty Dong of the University of California, San Francisco, going back to 1980. She did a limited study on Synthroid. Now, Synthroid is a drug that's given for people who have lost their thyroid. Your thyroid controls your metabolism and bodily functions. And due to cancer or other things that happen, people have their thyroids removed. And the thyroid produces thyroxine, and another hormone. When that's removed, if there is no thyroxine, your metabolism goes to zero. And of course, you know what happens to your body if that happens. So what needs to happen is when somebody has had their thyroid removed, there needs to be a daily supplement to replace the thyroxine. And there were 3 drugs on the market. Synthroid was the 4th. Synthroid was manufactured by the Boots Company. It was a UK company, and they went through several $100 million to develop Synthroid, and they passed it through phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials, and they got it approved by the FDA. And it's a very large market, $600 million to $800 million in the U.S. alone, $1 billion, well over $1 billion worldwide. So the Boots Company had this idea that they would give $250,000 to Betty Dong and her team at the University of California, San Francisco, to do a large study to compare it to the 3 inexpensive drugs that were on the market. And they hoped that it was going to show superior results to the cheaper replacements. So the study, however, did not show that Synthroid was superior to the inexpensive. In fact, when Betty Dong wrote the conclusion, she wrote a conclusion that the healthcare system could save $356 million a year by using the inexpensive drugs instead of recommending Synthroid. But for the next 7 years, the Boots Company suppressed those results. The contract that Boots had with Dong allowed them the right to pre-publish results and to approve or disapprove of the final report. And they spent, after her study, they spent the next 5 years to both discredit Dong and her team, to say that they were not qualified, and sending out papers to say that, and they alleged that what she had done was unethical and that her team was guilty of unethical conduct. And they questioned the study design. Even though they had pre-approved it, they questioned the study. They did all of that. But in 1994, Dong submitted her paper, and it was accepted by the American Medical Association, where it received peer review. She submitted it, but Boots exercised their veto. Boots itself was bought by Knoll Pharmaceuticals in 1995, and they continued to suppress the results. While Dong was unable to publish, Knoll published reinterpretation of her data showing that Synthroid was superior. They took the data, massaged the data, and showed that Synthroid was superior. Well, it all came down in 1997 when the Wall Street Journal did an investigation of Knoll and found that Dong's study had been misrepresented, and Dong was allowed to publish in the Journal of the American Medical Association. And that resulted in a class action suit against Synthroid, and Knoll actually settled that class action suit for $98 million. But the point of this whole thing is that Synthroid was not superior to cheaper drugs, but that the company that manufactured it suppressed the data, they attacked the clinical study, they attacked the person in charge of the clinical study, and when Boots was bought out, the Knoll Pharmaceutical Company did the same thing. Now, if we take a step back in history, in the 19th century, what we really had were gentlemen scientists who were essentially working in their own labs. You think of Fleming, who discovered I'll get to that, penicillin. He discovered it because he left a window open, went on vacation, his lab was in the house. The penicillin grew in a petri dish, and he discovered that discovered penicillin. A mold grew. World War II, things changed because military-industrial complex developed, and we developed research that began to happen within companies and for big science. The Big Science Manhattan Project. Scientists prior to that did their work that were beneficial to society. That began to change. And it was a very significant change. In 1970, the government spent $14.4 billion. Industry spent $10 billion in research. By 2015, the government was spending $200 billion. Industry, almost $400 billion. And today, that trend has continued to grow. And it's led to some big improvements: healthcare, electronics, travel, home appliances, entertainment, recreation, and I can go on and on. But there were significant drawbacks and conflict of interest, like Synthroid. It can fool some of the people some of the time, with all the people all the time. And investors need to understand what's being said. We're coming to a commercial break. Don't go away. Well, come back. I mean, one of the best examples was the tobacco industry. They knew in the 1950s that there was research showing smoking was hazardous to health. And yet they continued to produce the cigarettes. They continued to deny that there was any negative effect of tobacco smoke. And it wasn't until 40 years later. Hang on, we're coming back to this right after this commercial break.
About Money with Mike Adams on AM 1590, The Answer. For more information, click on Adams Financial. About Money with Mike Adams on AM 1590, The Answer. For more information, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com.
So I left off talking about the tobacco companies. Now, I had a friend that when I was in high school, this is the 1960s, I had a friend whose mother had what today we would call a nervous breakdown. She went to the doctor, and the doctor said to treat a nervous breakdown, what she should really do is take up smoking. You know, when you think about that today, that's just a horrifying thought. But in the 1960s, the 1950s, that was something that was pretty normal. It calmed your nerves, supposedly. But already in the 1950s, the tobacco companies knew that smoking was hazardous to your health. But they continued to set up research. They set up third-party organizations. The Council for Tobacco Research, for example, sounded scientific. It was funded by the tobacco companies. The Tobacco Research Institution produced 2,500 papers, and their mission was to show the positive impact of smoking. In fact, 65% of the newspaper articles were favorable to smoking. Only 9% raised any questions about the hazardous to your health. That all came down, as you know, and we live in a world in which smoking has been shown that it's hazardous to your health, but they knew in the 1950s. So we live in a world of spin. Revenue enhancements really mean taxes being increased. When you see a company talk about non-performing assets, that means that the business ventures failed. In the military, when they talk about collateral damage, they're talking about civilians who died. And there's two that I really love, both coming out of the military. One is vertically deployed anti-personnel devices. They drop those out of planes, vertical deployed anti-personnel devices. We used to call them bombs. And the other one is servicing the target, which really means killing the enemy. So almost everyone understands there's half-truths, weasel words, slick images. But what we don't understand is the science that goes behind that is not really science. There's product safety issues and news stories all the time. Often they're not mentioned that they're funded by corporations. Diametric opposed. to positions taken by independent groups. You know, Redux was defended and finally taken off the market, but it was defended. A number of companies, Anheuser-Busch, Pfizer Chemical, Philip Morris, Allstate Insurance Fund, American Cyanamid, Elanco, Eli Lilly, Monsanto, Upjohn, Chemical Manufacturers Association, Ciba-Geigy, the Beer Institute, Coors, and Chevron, all fund scientific papers that the science shows their point of view. And they're paying millions and millions of dollars to scientists to find favorable results for their products. You know, science is something that, if it's genuine, the theories look for something that can show that it's falsifiable, can show that it's not true. Pseudoscience is so vague you can never be proven true or false. And pseudoscience is being used to support things. Tobacco industry used it. They used it for decades, which all of that brings me to something I mentioned last week, the difference between the forecast between British Petroleum and Exxon Mobil. The forecast was for oil. For British Petroleum, their forecast for the next 30 years said we're seeing the highest demand for oil right now. And oil is going to decline for the next 30 years. Doesn't matter what governments are doing, oil is going to decline in the next 30 years. We're going to see renewable energy. Renewable energy is now cheap enough to produce that it can replace oil. And it burns without releasing the carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. That's what British Petroleum said. And I made a whole list of things that they said in their report. ExxonMobil, on the other hand, their forecast for the next 20 years said that oil was going to continue to increase, and whereas British Petroleum said oil was going to furnish only a very small percentage of energy needs by the year 2050, Exxon claimed that it was going to furnish half of energy needs by 2040. And the question last week was, will Exxon go the way of Eastman Kodak? Will they go the way? You know, the question is, I believe that they will. And there's another story that came out of Bloomberg. It was done by Kevin Crowley and Rashi. It was done in 2016. And it was the internal documents. No, I'm looking at a different paper. There was a new story that came out this week by those men. They published it on Bloomberg. And it showed the impact of ExxonMobil's plan for carbon emissions. Publicly, they talk about carbon capture and storage of carbon in Wyoming and Australia. They talk about their methane reduction in the U.S. They talk about flaring and energy efficiency. They talk about renewables and cogeneration that they're developing. All those are good. But what their internal documents are showing is that pales in comparison. Without those, they would increase the carbon dioxide emissions in the next 20 years by 26%. No, not the next 20 years, the next 5 years by 26%. With those carbon conservation methods, they're still going to increase by 17%. While British Petroleum and Royal Dutch Shell are reducing their emissions, ExxonMobil plans to increase their emissions. In 2017, they were emitting 122 million metric tons of carbon. 122 million. By 2025, even with the efforts that I mentioned above, to reduce, they're going to grow to 154 million metric tons. And that's going to continue to increase for the next 20 years. You know, and the reality is when you look at that, it understates the impact. What they're talking about in terms of emissions is what's called Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. Scope 1 and 2 are the emissions which your company directly emits by producing its product. What they actually emit by drilling, by burning, by flaring, by all the things that they do, that's the carbon that Exxon Mobil releases into the atmosphere. That's just that company's pollution going into the air. What it understates is the impact of what that has. When you think about gasoline and fuel and heating oil, that releases all sorts of additional carbon dioxide. Right now, it stands at around 600 million tons. Right now, in 2017, ExxonMobil was releasing itself 122, but the impact of that was almost 5 to 1. 4 to 1, 5 to 1. So if we're seeing them increase their emissions to almost 170 million metric tons, less what they're conserving, we're talking about almost 1 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide released by the products that ExxonMobil is putting out, and the impact of that in vehicles, in transportation, in energy-driven industries, that's an enormous amount. And those are only internal documents. What they're saying and what they're advertising is we're making all these changes in our system of production and we're actually reducing emissions. No, they aren't. They're increasing. Their internal documents are increasing. Just as the tobacco industry knew, they knew in the 1950s that smoking was hazardous to your health. ExxonMobil knows that the emissions they're putting into the atmosphere are increasing carbon dioxide. And they're a big spender when it comes to refuting climate change. They're part of that same thing that was denial that there is any climate change, that the climate change is happening, but it's not man-made. Climate change is just something that normally happens, but it's not man-made. We know, scientists know, 99+% of the scientists will say that it is man-made. You can get a picture of it. I use the illustration. When somebody drives your car, you drive it to a strip mall, you're going to go shopping, it's 85 degrees outside, you've got the air conditioner on in the car, it's a nice, comfortable 69 or 70 degrees. Get out of your car, spend an hour shopping, come back to the car, and the temperature in the car is 110 degrees. That's because the sun is shined on the car, and the energy released by that sunlight doesn't fully escape because it bounces off the roof of the car, and so you end up with more heat generated inside the car. That's how greenhouse gases work. That's how carbon dioxide works. That's what's going on. It's a very simple example, but it's a pretty accurate example of what's going on. We have a company, ExxonMobil, which plans to increase the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by a very significant amount. Like Bruce was saying, right. They want to conceal that from the public. But now you know. Now you know. We're coming to a commercial break very soon. If you missed this program or others, you can pick them up on YouTube by looking for About Money, and you can see what's going on. When we come back after commercial break, I'll be talking to John Jonas of Tuco Vanguard. We'll be talking about some of the things that he's doing. You want to hear that? Stay with me. We'll be right back after this commercial break.
About Money with Mike Adams on AM 1590, The Answer. For more information, click on Adams Financial Concepts. About Money continues. Remember the website, adamsfinancialconcepts.com. Here's Mike.
So I'm here with John Jonas of Tuco Vanguard. So, John, welcome to the program.
Hey, Mike. Thanks for having me.
So why don't we start with your background?
Okay. I started a little striping company, parking lot striping, when I was 17 and a half, right out of high school. I was going to just leaving high school and went to Bellevue Community College. And I was looking for something to make a couple of bucks with, and painting parking lots seemed like a reasonable thing to do. And I went and I knocked on a few doors, got one person, Lou Nichols, actually, Nichols Realty in Bellevue, still my customer, 43 years later. Asked him if he would let me give him a bid. He said, yeah. And so I did. And I had a 4-inch roller, a gallon of traffic paint, and 100 business cards. And that was the beginning of my company.
With a roller and a gallon of paint. That's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you've grown from that time. And
Yeah.
I mentioned the sidewalks that you've been doing. Tell us more about that.
Well, to clarify, I did not invent detectable warnings, and that's what those little yellow bumps are called. They're called detectable warnings or truncated domes. A dome is a half of a hemisphere, or half of a ball, if you will. Cut the ball in half. Truncated means the top of it's cut off. So if you look closely at those ramps, you'll see what appears to be a little rounded shape with a flat surface on it, and the little dots, if you will, are placed very specifically, 2.35 inches center to center from each other. And it literally means in Braille, and it is Braille, stop, be aware, you're about to enter a dangerous vehicular way. I did not, to clarify again, I did not invent that, but I invented a better way of making it because we were being asked in the early stages of the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, to install those. And we were trying various other companies' products, and I just couldn't make them work. I could not figure out a way to make these things stay on the ground where we put them. And I trial and error over and over again. I kept on thinking about it in my head, and it took about 4 years for the light bulb to go off, and I had this awakening that that's how you make this stuff. And we tried whatever process that was, 25 years ago, and it failed miserably because the concept was good, but the implementation was not so good. And so it took another 4 or 5 years before we got it dialed in, and now we literally have installers across the country under the Vanguard brand installing that, and we've got other products as well.
So you're moving on to even an additional improvement on that. Tell us about that.
Yeah, there's something that's always kind of in the back of my head is if these domes are for blind and visually impaired people, and that's essentially what they're for, to give warning for them, that tells you that beyond this point, X point is a dangerous vehicular way. So when you're leaving the sidewalk and you step on the ramp, you know that on the other side of that is where the cars are going to be. And for a visually impaired person, not so tough. But for a blind person, it's always bothered me. How do they know that this way is the correct way when sometimes these ramps point to the middle of the intersection instead of on the angle of the crosswalk? And so about 20 years ago, we came up with a product called Guide Strip, and it's essentially the same material, liquid plastic that we make on site, but we shape it in a grooved material. And the federal government has taken that concept. I don't think they got it from me, but they just came up with it on their own, I guess. And we had already developed the product. And so now they're talking about putting it on across crosswalks or at ramps in the angle of where the crosswalk will be. You've probably seen something similar to this at transit platform edges in like New York and Chicago, where you've got detectable warnings, the little bumps along the edge that says don't walk beyond this point because there's going to be a drop-off here. But then where the doors open up, they will put these grooved materials in. And the interesting thing is that all the other countries around the globe, Japan was first to do detectable warnings. Then I think it was Spain next, and the UK. The United States was late to the game, if you will. But now we're pretty much leading the charge on this whole thing, and we're coming up with, the feds are, they're coming up with all kinds of new ways to help blind and visually impaired people and help elderly people, traverse what they call the built environment. And it's pretty amazing what's going on out there.
It is pretty amazing. It's pretty amazing what you're doing. So
thank you.
You also started working on a project, I think it was in Lincoln Square, right?
Right. Yeah. We because of the domes and all that stuff, we would make this product out of liquid plastic. So we would put a background color on. In most cases, it would be yellow, and that was a liquid plastic. It was also non-skid, and we had people come up to us that said, "I love that product, but I don't need the domes. I love the way that it's non-skid. Can you just make it without the domes?" And we said, "Yeah, sure." And so that became Skid Guard. It was a liquid plastic non-skid coating that followed every nuance of the surface. And then we got a call from the contractor, the general contractor who's doing Lincoln Square 2 in downtown Bellevue, brand new project, I think in 2014 or thereabouts. And they needed a luminescent or glow-in-the-dark material to give warning or give notice, I guess, to the fire departments and such if there was a total power failure. So there would be markings that say no parking, fire stanchion or something like that right here, and then that would glow in the dark for 2 or 3 hours or something like that so that they could find where to hook up to in case everything failed. And so they asked us to come up with a product. I had looked around for products before because I knew that would be something that would be interesting to some of my clients, and I just wasn't happy with anything that I came up with and that I found. So GLY was the contractor, Orlando Young, and they approached me and said, "Well, we need you to do this. We need to come up with something." And I said, "Well, I can get you a sample of the other stuff." We had that set up. They didn't like it. It wasn't strong enough to glow. And so we played around with a whole bunch of different methods and stuff. And we came up with 3 different levels of luminescence, each one progressively stronger. And they chose the third one, the strongest luminescent, and it was very powerful. It was very luminescent, very glow in the darkish, for lack of a better way of saying it. But it didn't hold up to wear very long, and it really kind of just stayed in the back of my mind for years and years and years. And the problem with making a glow in the dark coating when you have a pigment like white or yellow or anything, it subsumes the luminescent material. It buries it, and so the more opaque the coating is, which you kind of want because it makes the coating stand out. You don't want a clear coating because that doesn't do well in ultraviolet light. And so we had to come up with a way of making the luminescent coating stand out and be strong and glow in the dark for a long period of time. And it literally took 3.5 years. That's now coming. That'll be available in February 1st, I believe it is, and it's being tested in public works departments across the country. That's called Lumiline 3000, and I think it's the first non-skid luminescent coating. There's lots of luminescent coatings out there, but I think this is the first non-skid one. It's the only one I'm absolutely certain of that has any kind of durability to it. So there's all kinds of stuff going on. People look at us and go, "Hey, I like this. Can you make it do thus and so?" And so we're always trying to figure out something new.
So I want to talk about the luminescent product because, I live in a condo building, and sometimes there have been times when we completely lose power. And when you're walking down the stairs, it's completely dark. You gingerly walk very carefully down the stairs, and the potential to fall is very significant. Talk about that.
Right. Well, it's interesting because in my early years of going around the country talking to various public works departments about detectable warnings and all these visual contrast things that were required by the Americans with Disabilities Act and stuff, I started looking at every different possible scenario wherein which a visual contrast was required. And we started seeing things where we'd see stair treads that some people would stand back a little bit and they would look at a set of stairs and they would think, "Oh my gosh, that's a ramp." It's not. It's called, and the visual failure, if you will, is called visual agnosia. It leaves blank holes in your perception of color and depth. And so that's why you need to have those contrasting colors on the front of the stair treads, not to tell somebody where to step, but to tell somebody that there is a step there, because some people just can't see it. And so That's what we're seeing. We're seeing a big demand for around the country. And then for people that have visual contrast issues at an age issue for age eyes, the glow in the dark even helps in the daytime because it gives one more little hue to hit your eyes with.
So, John, tell us how we can contact you. Which website? Tell us how we can contact. Yeah.
Well, the website is tilco.net for the local construction company and vanguardonline.com for the manufacturing company, and that's the company that ships those products across the country. The tilco.net is the local construction company for Seattle. Our phone number is 425-483-5700, and that's about it. Yeah.
So give us the names of the websites once again.
Sure. Tilco.net. And that's tilco.net, and then the other is vanguardonline.com.
Perfect.
All one word.
Great story. Thanks for being on. And we are coming to a commercial break. When we come back, I've got a lot to talk about. So don't go away. I will be right back after the commercial break. And we are coming right now.
About Money with Mike Adams on AM 1590, The Answer. For more information, click on Adams Financial. About Money with Mike Adams on AM 1590, The Answer. For more information, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com.
So, how do you evaluate a financial advisor? How do you really look? Do you look at the returns? Do you look at the financial plan? Is an advisor hiding behind financial plans? Do you think one financial advisor is like another, is like another, is like another? Is it something that you just want somebody that you like or someone that gives you really great returns? Is a doctor a doctor? Is a doctor? Are all doctors the same? Are all attorneys the same? One attorney after another attorney after another attorney. Why do some attorneys command the fees that they charge much higher than others? Would you hire a general practitioner to do brain surgery? Probably not. You want someone who does brain surgery. So financial advisors are licensed either under the Securities and Exchange Act of 1932 or the Investment Company Act of 1940. And since 2008, there have been a lot of things going on in the industry. Those advisors for the brokerage firms are registered representatives. The investments they recommend have only to be suitable. They have only to be suitable. If you have a small cap fund where one pays a 1% commission to the advisor and one pays an 8% commission to the advisor can recommend the financial advisor, the registered rep under the 1932 Act. He can recommend the 8%. Even though it's to the detriment of the client. But it is a small cap fund, and he can make that recommendation, or she can make that recommendation. Registered investment advisors are held to a fiduciary standard under the 1940 Act. You know, that every decision has to be made in the best interest of the client. And that's where all this has started. During the 2007-2008 Great Recession, the banks were in trouble. And banks are funny. Banks, brokerage firms, insurance firms are very interesting because when they're in trouble, they want the government to bail them out, to save them. But as soon as they're beyond the crisis, what do? They want the government out of their business. But in the crisis, when the banks were in all that trouble, what happened is Congress started to move, the Obama administration started to move to pass the Graham-Dodd Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act. And it would have happened if if Obama was elected or had McCain been elected. There was a lot of buildup because having the banks in trouble meant that there were things that they were doing, the brokerage firms were doing, the banks were doing, the insurance companies were doing, that really almost brought the financial system to an end. The Financial Stability Oversight was established, and the Graham-Dodd Wall Street Protection Act was passed in 2010. It was designed to give investors protection. It was designed to give Wall Street transparency and accountability. It was designed to prevent predatory lending. Multiple other things were included in that. But the one thing they could not reach agreement on was a fiduciary standard, a standard that said every interest would be made in the best interest of the client. So the Graham-Dodd bill came out, and they punted that to the Securities and Exchange Commission and Department of Labor to come up with a fiduciary rule in 2 years. Well, that never happened. But the idea was they're the experts in this area, so make a fiduciary rule which every financial advisor has to follow. Every employee of either a brokerage firm, a bank, or an insurance company has to be a fiduciary acting in the best interest of their clients. Every single one. And the essence was to make registered reps toe the line with investment advisors. I'm an investment advisor. And when you think of what was going on in 2007, 2008, one of the biggest examples was Goldman Sachs, because John Paulson ran a hedge fund, and he wanted to short some of the toxic subprime mortgages. So Goldman put some together. They sold the short to Paulson. He sold that, expecting it to go down and buy back when it was at a much lower price. But they also sold the other side. They sold the long side to somebody and convinced the other person that they were going to go up. So to Paulson, they were saying they're going to go down. To the other side, they said they were going to go up. And they collected fees on both sides. That was a big example that brought around this fiduciary rule. How can you say to one party that it's going to be positive in there when they're betting against the other party? So the Department of Labor actually did come up with a fiduciary standard. And I happened to be at lunch with the lobbyists. There were about 40 of us at lunch. And they delivered their report. They essentially wrote the Department of Labor's law that went into effect, the verbiage. It was almost word for word. And it was driven by the big banks and the brokerages. Why I was invited to lunch, I will never know. Was it a mistake? Possibly. I don't know. But I was sitting at the table with some of the leaders of the National Association of Pension Advisors. They were all from Merrill, Morgan Stanley, Wells Fargo, UBS, and Adams Financial Concepts. Wait a minute. What was I doing there? I don't know. It was almost comical when you think about it. They were the big firms. They were pushing so hard to get this all written. And they wanted to make it sound like it was really a fiduciary rule. But there's a difference between what they wanted and what the 40 Act said. The 40 Act said every decision in the best interest of clients. That's what you have to do. The Department of Language fiduciary rule came out, and it was all about how do you do it. The language developed by the big brokerage houses was essentially a lot of rules and regulations. Just make sure you follow the rules and you're okay. Doesn't have to be in the best interest of the client. Just follow the rules. So what happened is the Department of Labor proposed the rule. It was struck down by the courts because the new administration didn't defend it. And the Securities and Exchange developed what's called the best interest rule, which sounds like it's fiduciary. It's not. It essentially is not in the best interest of clients. It's essentially charges, as long as you charge the same fee for mutual funds, you're okay, no matter what else you do. Hidden fees are okay, and going back to 2007, 2008, hidden fees took up to 50% of the returns, taking the returns that that employees were putting into or getting in their 401ks, gave those returns to Wall Street, took advantage of Main Street, not to the clients. It gave them to Merrill, Morgan Stanley, UBS, and the insurance companies. Now with the latest things coming out, they've taken away the language, they've taken away the law, and they've taken away everything about the 40 Act. No longer do financial advisors have to follow any of that. That's a really sad situation. We can only hope that if we have a change of administration, that will in fact change. It'll be driven by Main Street instead of Wall Street. That wraps us up for today. I will be doing a money show coming this coming week. You can hear me. Log on to moneyshow.com and find me on that. You can hear me, what I have to say. Until next Saturday, have a very great week, and I will be back to talk about money.
Listening to About Money with Mike Adams, a registered investment advisor. If you'd like more information about what you heard today, or about Mike's investment philosophy and strategy, or if you'd like Mike to evaluate your own portfolio, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com. That's adamsfinancialconcepts.com. The information shared in the preceding program was for educational purposes only, and any investment advice given may not be suitable for all investors. Join us again next Saturday at noon for more About Money with Mike Adams here on AM 1590. The Answer. The preceding program was sponsored by Adams Financial Concepts.